Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started here. This session will be recorded. Hello and welcome to Sterling and VMware's Power Block session. I am Megan Moore, Sterling's VMware Partner Business Manager. We know your time is valuable, so I want to say thank you for choosing to spend a portion of your day with Sterling and VMware. Before we dive into the demo, I wanted to give you a brief overview of Sterling's capabilities. Sterling is a principal VMware partner and a preferred services partner authorized to sell and service VMware solutions to customers across the nation. With 50 plus technical staff and 75 plus sales staff, all trained on VMware offerings, we are sure to provide you with an industry best value on all of your client cloud needs. As you can see from this slide, Sterling holds many VMware competencies, including 2 master services competencies and more coming soon. Next slide, please. Sterling offers complete customized solutions from client to cloud. We serve on multiple federal, state, and local government contracts and support all industry verticals. Security is of the utmost importance here at Sterling. We have a robust, secure supply chain, including OTIPs and CMMC certifications. For any questions about Sterling, please use the email aliases you will find at the end of the demo. For questions during the demo, please put them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and we'll address them at the end. Now I will turn it over to Cloud Architect Nathan Bennett to demonstrate vRealize automation with ABX.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Megan. This is Nathan Bennett here. I'm very happy to see so many different people joining us from all around and glad that you decided to spend this time with us. So today we're going to look into ABX, or action-based extensibility, in connection with vRealize automation. A little bit in terms of an agenda. So we're going to take a look at the infrastructure that we're going to be using, or I'll just basically tell you that we're utilizing a VCF on vRealize for our deployment endpoint, and we're going to be using vRealize Automation 8.3 for our ABX action extensibility. We're using a single instance, which is just a lot cleaner for our webinar in order to view. And we're going to show a couple of different things with ABX. In terms of this slide deck, we're going to go through a little bit in terms of why vRealize automation is so powerful in today's world, why a platform as a service is extremely useful for operations team, as well as just business enterprises that currently have an on-prem as well as public cloud connections as well. And then a little bit in terms of what's so powerful about this extensibility, and we're going to focus on ABX on this one. Now, I know for those that have seen vRealize automation and are a little bit aware of icons, that what you're actually seeing on the screen on the left side is ABX extensibility, but on the right side is actually vRealize orchestrator. Now, for those that have used vRealize automation, orchestrator is kind of the bread and butter of vRealize automation. It's what does a lot of the behind the scenes work. And so understanding how to utilize that and extend that with vRealize automation is extremely powerful. ABX is kind of the same thing. So you can go different ways with vRealize automation in terms of extending that out. You can use ABX if you're more familiar with coding functions and changing objects and resources and re-injecting them into payloads. Or you can use vRealize orchestrator, and you can connect them in multiple different life cycles of your builds in order for them to run and do multiple different things. And then once we're going to jump into a live demo. I'm going to show a couple of different ways that ABX can be utilized for your customers. And then it will take questions and time after that. So when I discuss vRealize automation, I really want to drive home why vRealize automation is so powerful in today's modern world. And I do that. I think one of the strongest views of why this is powerful is shadow IT. A lot of businesses deal with shadow IT where there is source code material or infrastructure that's out there that's being billed to the business, but they don't know why or where it came from. And it all kind of comes along this sort of story that I like to tell. And it normally starts with Jack, independent user, maybe he's a support guy, maybe he's a developer. But Jack needs to get some resources up and running. He needs some infrastructure in order to do a QA task or maybe develop some code, something along those lines. And so what does Jack do? Well, Jack's a good employee of the business. And so he creates a ticket or calls his operations team and says, hey, I need these resources. And then it goes into this kind of waiting state where Jack is saying, okay, where is my resources? When am I going to get them? What is happening right now? And so Jack starts in his own mind wondering, when is this going to happen? And then it kind of starts this whole back and forth between Jack and operations of what's the holdup? What can I do in order to expedite this? Or how can I move this forward? And what eventually happens is that Jack starts thinking, okay, you know what? This isn't a waiting state. This is a brick wall. I'm not actually going to be able to get these resources. I need to find a different way of doing this because I've still got a manager who still needs to meet his deadline and he's holding me to that deadline and he's getting tired of these excuses that I'm giving. So what Jack does is he goes into the public cloud and he says, okay, well, I can just go to any of these public clouds, swipe a credit card, or just create a basic developer account and build whatever resources I need. And so using that platform as a service in the public cloud, Jack starts thinking, this is really powerful. I really like this. And so he leaves those resources out there, and those resources have business critical functions and source code that's out there that he can now use for multiple different reasons. And so that's basically one of the ways that shadow IT is created. Another factor of this is that Jack starts becoming a shadow IT evangelist. He starts telling people within his company, hey, this was really easy and was really fast. And he starts kind of bringing other people into this mindset, and then shadow IT just continues to grow. And so we kind of lose focus on whatever the policies and governance of the business really are in order to maintain the secrets that are crucial to the business. And we step out bounds of those things. And, it doesn't matter if you are, 80% of the tickets that come through operations are taken care of in a very quick way. It matters those one or two times when this sort of scenario happens, because once that happens, basically the seed of a platform as a service deployment technology has taken hold, and now you've got to work against that methodology. Well, that's exactly what vRealize Automation does, right? vRealize Automation uses Service Broker as a catalog service. So Jack can go into, can log into vRealize Automation and then select whatever catalog he wants to run. If it's infrastructure as a service through Cloud Assembly, he can do that. If it's a CI/CD pipeline where he's pushed his code to a GitHub or GitLab repo, wherever it might be, or Bitbucket, he can pull that through the CI/CD pipeline and inject it into production. If it's anything as a service, via vRealize Orchestrator or ABX, you can also utilize those things as well. I've used vRealize Automation in a long time, and I like to talk about how to make it this successful, because a lot of times custom-based automation doesn't really find legs to stand on in many different scenarios. But this flows really well with ABX, because what it really boils down to is finding kind of the smaller things, right? So find the first thing that you need to actually automate is the repetitive actions, the things that you do many different times in a day, but they are relatively quick. Maybe it takes like 20 minutes, half a minute, or a minute in order to do one of those actions, right? Well, if you're able to automate that action, you've actually saved the time of actually performing that function, as well as save the time of the user putting in the ticket, and the operations guy pulling the ticket back. So it actually saves a huge amount of time on both sides, and that continues to scale. It continues to grow. You can use an analogy of like the snowball that you get pushed off of the top of the hill, and it just continually grows and grows. It might start really small, but it's the building blocks that continually grows onto other things. Then the next thing is normally the high ticket load. These are not necessarily repetitive actions that are quick, but they're the things that are in the operations queue or whichever queue that you're automating that are many different or multiples of the same thing. And these are definitely the pain points of the operations team and or the networking team or whichever team that you have. So when you find these things, you just focus on those and you continue to grow that that catalog of services. Finally, this is the check your ego at the door, because you need to actually sit down with the customer, which is normally not a fun discussion. And you need to find what are the pain points, what are the problems that the customer has, or this customer, quote unquote, may be a support person, maybe a developer, maybe a networking team individual. It's normally just someone from a different team outside of whichever team normally has to perform these tickets or calls for resources. So if I could boil all of this down, it's all about automating the quick and easy first and the large and heavy last. Really, it's all about, again, that snowball technique or the building blocks of building the solution. And this really flows well into ABX because ABX is different small functions or functions as a service, which you can utilize to extend your infrastructure as a service through Cloud Assembly or just a function itself into your service broker and allow users to use those. It's very small when you think about the atomic unit of ABX, but it's also very powerful. And I like to think of ABX as a kind of road of least resistance in terms of function as a service, because a lot of times you kind of get pigeonholed into these little areas, whereas ABX has multiple different languages. So say you're pretty good in Python in some areas, you're good with PowerShell in some areas, or you're good with Node.js. It has multiple different languages, it actually has those particular 3 languages that, now that I think about it, Node.js, Python, and PowerShell, which you can utilize for different actions. And then you can take these actions that you write as the atomic unit of one particular action and then combine them together in what's called flows. And these flows are, again, they don't all have to be a specific action, right? A specific language. They can all be different languages that use inputs and outputs from either a payload or however you're scripting your functions. And then you can combine them together and use decisions and things of that nature in order to perform, an entire function in multiple different layers. Finally, the extensibility, right? This is the part where we say, you can connect this into, your IaaS in different parts of its life cycle, right? So say that you want to run a specific function that changes something at the beginning of a deployment before anything's actually even started, you can do that. Say you want to call out and pull specific resource information into an email or Slack channel or, whatever REST API call that you're trying to do, you can do that in that particular lifecycle. So there's multiple different layers in this onion that you can peel apart in order to figure out where you actually want to use your ABX actions. And it actually leads to a number of different solutions that you can write yourself. So with that said, let's just go ahead and jump into the demo. And let's go ahead and we bring this down. So we see here that we are connected into my 8.3. Oop, just kicked me out. So let me log back in here. Makes sense. I wasn't keeping it logged in. There we go. So first place I'm going to go is actually Service Broker. And I'm going to do this to kind of show the differences between basic automation and custom-based automation, right? So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy this basic deployment. So this is a out-of-the-box basic VM. I'm just going to say basic VM and submit. And this is basically just pulling, a VMware machine over to the canvas as well as a network connection. So I'm building a virtual machine with a network connection so it can, call out to the public internet. Now, the thing that I wanted to point out here is the naming convention that is default, right? There's multiple different ways that you can do naming in vRealize automation. But the basic naming convention is a little crazy. And we'll show that to you in just a second. But one of the ways that a lot of people use ABX is to actually using an input specify the name. So I'm just going to call this a name deployment. And I'm just going to call it VM. Let's just use VM name. And then I'll submit that. And so what I just basically did, for those that are used to like vRealize 7 and previous, you're kind of used to having an input for the actual name of the VM. In vRealize 8, it's a little bit more convoluted in how you do naming. And so this is one of the really easy ways of using ABX in order to specify an input to name a virtual machine to a specific name. So let me bring up our VxRail. And just as an example, here is our vCenter. And this is the default name for that machine, that first machine that I built that had no input and was just basically the default. You can kind of tell from this name, it's not very helpful to parse or understand what this really is. Yes, you can pull it through the deployment. You can change it from the deployment name and track it through vRealize automation. But if you're an operations guy and you see things like this, it kind of lets you ask questions. And then this is much easier to read, right? So when you see this, it's a lot easier to say, okay, this is what that VM is. This is the name that the person specified. So if I hop back over to our vRealize automation area, let's hop into Cloud Assembly and then start playing around or looking into the ABX actions that we have. And you can do that by going to Cloud Assembly and then into Extensibility and then under Actions. So we can see here I have a number of different actions that are here and a number of different flows. Multiple different languages, right? So I have Node.js, I have PowerShell, and I have Python scripts. And they're all doing different functions as a service. They're all relatively small in terms of what they're actually doing. But that's kind of the whole point, right? I mean, like, I'm not a big fan of creating this huge script. I like to try to keep them relatively small and then connect them together in flows. If we move into our action run, we can actually see that name change that we just ran through the service broker. Actually, here we can see the run, and we can actually see the outputs and information of how ABX actually performs the actions that it does. So this is in PowerShell, and we're just pulling in this function, parsing out a couple of attributes from the information that we get from the payload. And then we're creating a return object with the same resource name specification, injecting a variable into that, and then returning it. And the returning part is very important because whatever you return actually gets injected into the data. And so it becomes way more important when you get into flow, because if you're trying to change something and pass it from one place to the next, you have to return that object to make sure that it's being passed. So same thing as inputs and outputs. If you're familiar with vRealize automation, if you want something to be maintained or pushed, you can use an output to go from one ABX action to the next, and the inputs can be pulled in. It's just a more codified way of doing it. Over here on the details, we can actually see all of the different pieces of information from the payload. It can be a little bit of an eyesore looking at all of these things. But the only thing that I really wanted to show here is in terms of naming. Here we see that here's the actual default name that the machine was actually going to name it. It's that same kind of long naming scheme that we've seen before. But down here, we see that by the ABX action, it just changed the resource name to this particular name, right? And so it's actually just changing that particular parameter into this variable. If we go into the log, we can see all of our write host for those that are familiar with PowerShell to view all of the different changes that we're setting, right? So we see here that the current name, what it is, just some basic information that we're starting the ABX action, and that it's setting the name from this long name to this long name, right? So it kind of gives you a good understanding of how ABX actions really work. So I'm going to close out of this, and let's take this a little to the next step. Okay. I'm going to go into my blueprint design, and let's have fun with this, and let's do a function where we just generate a randomized password. A lot of people will use this because enterprise environments sometimes don't use, it's normally not the best practice to have the same password for multiple different VMs. And so you can actually use ABX to create a strong generated password, and then inject that password into whatever password vault that you have, right? And you can inject it whatever, if it's an an API webhook method, if it's something that you can do via REST, or if it's something that you have to swivel chair it and just get it to from one place to the next, you can connect all of these things with ABX to do this. For this particular example, I'm using Slack. As you can see, throughout most of this demo, I've had just a whole bunch of incoming webhook lines just sitting there. And we're going to use Slack in order to take this password and then push it back to us. I'm going to go ahead and deploy this blueprint, and then we'll walk through this a little bit. So I'll just name it PW, and instead of doing the default, let's just call this demo VM. I'll just call this demo, just a name that I haven't used before, and I'm going to kick that off. So in a little bit, we should see the webhook pop up over here saying what the name of the VM is, and then what the password will be. But as we're waiting, I want to show these two lines right here, right? So these are what's known as custom properties within the actual virtual machine. These are not properties that are set based off of normal vRealize automation, cloud assembly, YAML code, right? If I hit enter and create a new line, and I look through all of the parameters that it gives me, I will not find these two parameters here. And also, we just see our webhook just kicked off with the password and the name of the virtual machine. So that's good. The live demo gods are with us today. What I'm trying to get to in terms of these properties is that these are specific parameters that I'm setting to then be utilized via ABX. So if I go into my action flow that I'm using for this, which is this guy right here, this password flow, we can see both via a script as well as graphically what is actually happening. So the first thing that it's going to do, I'm going to click this little eyeball to show it, is I'm running this Python code that basically creates a generated password and prints it out. And then it outputs it into the necessary properties to be returned back into the payload. And that's just the first action. So I just generated a password, and I re-injected it into the payload. None of that was with Slack, right? So the reason for that is because the next part of the flow is actually written in PowerShell, not Python. And in PowerShell, it's a little bit easier to script that webhook connection. So this is where it gets into that road of least resistance. You don't have to be like the best PowerShell or Python or Node.js guy on the planet. I can jokingly state like Stack Overflow is there for you, because a lot of these functions can be utilized for people that understand to a certain degree what they're trying to do and can utilize these functions and combine them to do what they're looking at doing in a full set of solution. Excuse me. So this PowerShell function is basically just connecting to the Slack URI and then creating the body template that I am sending it. I'm not sure why I decided to use the ghost. It just ended up being something that I put into the body. And then of course it invokes it, and that's how it creates that webhook. You also have the ability on ABX action flows to create an error. So on error, you can actually run a specific function. And my function here is very basic. All this really does is it just pulls all the properties and just prints it out. So it's just kind of a way of error checking and verifying what's there, and trying to make sure that, what should be there is there, what isn't there, shouldn't be there, right? So that's how that password setting worked for that last machine that I just did. So let's go to it real quickly. I'm going to bring up my machine, and I see my IP address here. I'm going to come down here to my terminal. I'm just going to SSH into it with that particular user that I just had, or that I just created with the password. And hop into that machine. Yes. And we're just going to connect with this password here. Just going to copy and paste. And there we go. So now we're locked into that machine. So, it's in the sudo group, so I can connect via that. I can also run multiple different functions here, just like apt update, whatever, right? I have access to the machine to run what I need to run. So that gives you a little bit of example of the ways ABX can be extended with your cloud assembly as well as other functions. So one last thing. So I showed how all that worked. I just wanted to show real quickly here. If I go back to the action runs, when you run a password, when you run a flow, excuse me, what it actually does is it runs the flow, but then each individual part of the flow is actually ran as a specific GUID as well. So for instance, here's the password flow, and here's the nested actions that are running. So you might kind of get thrown a little bit if you're trying to look through it in order to troubleshoot. But you can also just click right here on the password flow itself, and then click specifically on each one of these in order to go to those areas. For instance, for this webhook connection, I can click there and then go to the log, and I can see, I got an okay response back showing that it did connect to the webhook and send the information that I needed. So I'm going to stop there. Let me bring back our PowerPoint, and then we can take any questions.
Nathan, we do have a couple questions here. So the first one is, how do you set up decisions in ABX?
Oh, yeah, that'd be good to show. So that was a short-lived PowerPoint slide there. So yeah, let me bring this up here. So in a flow, you can have the option to set what's known as a switch action. Now, a switch action is basically a custom-based decision, however you want to create your inputs and outputs. So you can create a decision based on off of that output, right? So for instance, here I'm setting, if this output tag is, yes, go to dump, which is, this guy right here. This is another kind of fun fact, the default flow specifies like action 1, action 2. If that's not your style and you want to put actual names to each function, you can actually do that and then call those functions directly. I can say, I can change this to a different output here. So say I want to change this to rename. And then here I want to say, I want this to go to rename. You can just change all of these things, and it'll change it graphically here to specify what you're actually doing. But that's a real basic example of how you can create a switch. You can do multiple switches too. So for instance, this is a if else, I could do like do rename equals Python. I don't know. Just say something different, and then say go to rename, right? Hopefully I did that right. Yeah. Okay, cool. So now I I've got like multiple different decisions. It's however you want to create that decision-based solution in order to set those things. Obviously, you probably want to do it more binary than what I just did. Like for instance, you don't want to do a not equals in your decision. But I just did that as a way of showing that you can do switches for multiple different things. So that's kind of how switches would work for this.
And then we do have one more question. It is, can you use ABX as its own catalog?
Oh, yeah. So let me hop over here to Service Broker. So Service Broker is what holds all of your service catalogs. This is where you basically have the information. It's where we started out the live demo. This is where users log in and actually request resources through vRealize automation. So if you go into kind of the back end of Service Broker and look at the content sources, if I said new, just right there, I can just bring in whatever extensibility actions that I want, set it to a specific project. I can validate it, source. Yeah, I know source name's empty. And then we can bring those action based extensibilities directly. That way, what you're basically doing is you're using functions as a service without actually extending them from your IaaS or your cloud assembly. So you're basically running specific functions outside of everything else, kind of like how vRealize Orchestrator is like anything as a service. You would be using ABX as a complete function as a service at that point.
Great. That is
I'll
all
bring
the
this-
questions we have today. Thank you so much, Nathan. If you guys have any questions that come up after this demo, please do not hesitate to reach out to any of the email aliases you see here listed on the screen. We're happy to help you. If you would like a follow-up demo, if you have coworkers or contacts you think would really benefit from seeing this demo as well, we do record all of our demos, so we're happy to get this to you. Otherwise, we're also happy to set up a customized demo one-on-one for a group as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out, and thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great day.